The silent shadows of the playground. Officer Ethan Mitchell sat in his patrol car, the hum of the engine as steady and familiar as the rhythm of his everyday life. It was a quiet evening. The suburban neighborhood bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The houses, all painted in muted pastel colors, lined the street like soldiers standing at attention. Lawns were meticulously trimmed, and garden gnomes sat proudly in front yards, frozen in time, as if waiting for the next passerby to notice them. As he drove past the local park, Ethan's eyes naturally flickered over to the swings. It was one of his usual routes, and most days, the park was a busy place, filled with kids running around, laughing and playing games. But today was different. The air was thick with a feeling of quiet that seemed to linger over everything. The streets were almost empty, just a few people walking their dogs, and the faint sound of a lawnmower hums somewhere in the distance. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Ethan's gaze landed on a small figure perched on one of the swings. A young girl, no older than 10 or 11, swinging slowly back and forth under the sheltering branches of an old oak tree. Her dark hair shimmered in the low light, strands catching the sun's dying rays. She wore a threadbare hoodie, its sleeves too long for her arms, and faded jeans that hung loosely around her legs. She looked so out of place, too small, too alone in the vast emptiness of the park. Ethan frowned as he slowed his patrol car, his fingers momentarily tightening around the steering wheel. The sight of the girl struck him with a sense of unease, though he couldn't pinpoint why. It wasn't uncommon for children to be at the park alone, especially this time of day, when parents could get caught up with work or errands. But the stillness in the air made everything seem heightened, as though the playground itself was holding its breath. He muttered to himself, more to break the strange silence than anything else. Probably just another kid with a bit of free time. He'd seen it all before. The kids who lingered in parks, the teenagers who roamed the streets at night. It was part of the job, one he'd grown so accustomed to that it had become routine. He didn't need to worry about it. There were other officers around. They would handle whatever came up. But there was something about this girl that made him pause. Her eyes, Ethan caught a glimpse of them for just a second, were fixed on the ground in front of her. Her lips pressed together in an expression that suggested she was lost in thought, or perhaps in some way waiting. The officer sighed, adjusting the rearview mirror before pulling away. Just another day, he murmured under his breath, as his patrol car rolled down the block and away from the park. As he turned the corner, the girl's figure faded into the background, swallowed by the darkness of the evening. But a feeling lingered in his chest, an unsettling tug that he couldn't quite shake. It was a whisper, small and insistent, that told him he hadn't seen the full picture. The quiet continued to settle over the neighborhood, the only sounds now the occasional creak of a distant tree or the soft rustle of the wind in the leaves. As Ethan made his rounds, his thoughts started to wander. He thought about the empty apartment waiting for him at the end of his shift, the stark, cold silence that greeted him every night. There were no family photos lining the walls, no warm meals waiting for him, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The loneliness had become part of his routine, something he had long since accepted. His job was his purpose. He had sworn an oath to protect, and he threw himself into his work with a kind of dedication that left no room for personal attachments. Family. He'd always told himself there would be time for that later, after the next case, after the next promotion. But later never came. Ethan found himself turning down streets on autopilot, his mind detached from the world around him. It was almost like the uniform, the badge, and the patrol car had become an extension of himself. Everything outside of it, his own life, his own happiness, had faded into the background. That was just the way things were. Yet, in the back of his mind, the image of the girl on the swing lingered. Her stillness, her solitude, kept drawing him back. Something wasn't right about that girl, he thought again, but the thought was fleeting. There were always kids in parks, nothing to worry about. As he continued his patrol, the night began to deepen. The shadows grew longer, and the quiet streets became more pronounced. The sound of crickets chirping filled the air, but it was a sound Ethan had become accustomed to. His routine was all he needed, until he came back around to the park again. Ethan slowed down, instinctively glancing toward the swings. The park seemed even quieter now, the darkness spreading like ink across the ground. The playground equipment loomed like strange, skeletal figures in the low light. His headlights illuminated the scene for just a moment, and there, to his surprise, was the same girl, but this time she wasn't swinging. She was lying on the bench beneath the tree, curled into a ball, her small form barely visible in the dim light. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The chill of the night air pressed against his skin as a wave of concern surged through him. What was she doing here? Why wasn't she at home, or at least with someone? His instincts kicked in. He couldn't just drive by. Not this time. He pulled over sharply, the gravel crunching beneath his tires as he stopped just a few yards from the playground. His boots hit the pavement with a soft thud as he stepped out of the car, moving toward the bench where the girl was lying. The air felt colder now, sharper, like it was carrying the weight of something unspoken. He stood over her for a moment, watching the way her small body huddled into itself, seeking warmth in the cold night. She looked so tiny and fragile, her hoodie now pulled over her head to shield herself from the wind. His eyes scanned her, taking in the state of her clothing, faded, torn in places, clearly worn from days of use. "Hey there," Ethan called out gently, his voice softer than usual. He bent down, careful not to startle her, and reached out to lightly shake her shoulder. "Hey, sweetheart, wake up. It's getting late." The girl's eyelids fluttered open, but it wasn't fear that immediately greeted him. It was confusion. Her gaze slowly focused on him, and the wariness in her eyes softened into something else. But there was still something in her expression that made Ethan pause. She wasn't just startled by the presence of a police officer. She was guarded, as though she expected something bad to happen. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, crouching beside her now, trying to hide the concern in his voice. Her eyes darted around the park, as if checking for an escape route, before locking onto his once more. She blinked and rubbed her eyes sleepily. But there was something else there, something deeper. The fear had melted away, replaced by a quiet, almost reluctant acceptance. It was clear to Ethan now. This wasn't a lost child or someone who'd simply stayed out too late. This was a girl who had nowhere to go. And the truth hit him harder than anything he'd ever experienced on the job. With the weight of the realization hanging heavily in the air, Ethan knew that he couldn't just walk away from this. Not this time. Something had to change, but he wasn't sure what that would look like yet. The unseen struggle. Ethan knelt on the ground beside Leah, his eyes searching hers for some hint of understanding. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing in around him, but he couldn't seem to find the right words. It wasn't often that he was left speechless, but here, in front of this small, fragile girl, everything he had learned about his job, about control, seemed irrelevant. "Hey," he said again, softer this time, his voice almost a whisper. "You don't have to be out here alone. Come on, let's get you somewhere safe. It's late, and it's getting cold." Leah didn't respond at first. She just sat there, her gaze flicking between him and the darkening park around them, as if trying to make sense of the situation. Ethan couldn't help but notice how small she looked against the vastness of the playground. The swings creaking in the wind, the empty slides, and the looming shadows all felt oppressive now. The park that had once seemed like a place of childhood innocence now felt like a cold, empty cage, and Leah, curled up on the bench, was its captive. Her eyes, wide and guarded, seemed to study Ethan for a long moment. She looked at him as if she were sizing him up, as if deciding whether or not to trust him. Her small body trembled slightly, whether from the cold or from something deeper, Ethan couldn't say. "I'm not gonna hurt you," Ethan continued, keeping his tone calm and steady. "But I can't leave you here. You deserve better than this." Leah seemed to consider his words, but then something shifted in her expression, something darker, more resigned. She slowly pulled her knees closer to her chest, hugging them tightly with her arms, and lowered her head. The flicker of hope that had briefly appeared in her eyes disappeared, replaced by a kind of hardened sadness that Ethan had seen in the eyes of far too many people who had learned to expect nothing, to ask for nothing. Ethan's heart sank. He couldn't fathom what it must be like to be so young, yet already so disillusioned, so worn down by life. He stayed silent for a few moments, watching her. He wasn't sure if she was just too tired to respond, or if something deeper was keeping her from speaking. But something inside him told him that this wasn't just about being tired. No, this was something much bigger than that. "Leah," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "what happened to you? Why are you out here by yourself?" She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained downcast, her lips pressing together as though holding back words that were too painful to speak. It was as if her silence was its own form of protection, a way to keep the world at bay, to guard herself from whatever had brought her to this moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Leah spoke, her voice barely audible, but still carrying a weight that made Ethan's stomach tighten. They don't care about me," she muttered, the words falling from her lips like stones. Ethan's brow furrowed. He could hear the sorrow in her voice, but he wasn't sure he understood fully what she meant. "Who doesn't care about you, Leah?" "My mom." Leah nodded, the movement so slight that it almost looked like she was shaking her head instead. But then she spoke again, her voice trembling now, like a leaf caught in the wind. I don't remember where they went. They just disappeared." Ethan's heart ached for her. He could feel the weight of her words in the pit of his stomach, that sickening sense of helplessness that came when someone was abandoned, especially a child. He couldn't imagine what it must be like to be so young and to face such overwhelming loss. "Leah," Ethan began again, taking a slow step closer to her. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to accomplish, but something told him that his next words would be critical. "Where have you been staying? Do you have somewhere to go?" She didn't answer right away, but her eyes flickered toward the dark playground, and then to the streetlights in the distance. It was as if she were looking for an escape, a reason to stay where she was. "I stay here," Leah said finally, her voice so quiet that Ethan had to strain to hear her. "In the park. I sleep in the swings sometimes, or under the tree. The ground is cold, but it's better than being at the shelter." Ethan felt a surge of anger in his chest. A child, his mind screamed. No child should have to live like this, should have to sleep in a park, in the dark, with no one around to protect her. His job, his training, it all seemed like it had prepared him for confrontations with criminals, for chasing down suspects, for enforcing the law. But nothing could have prepared him for this. "The shelter?" Ethan asked, his voice rising with concern. "What's wrong with the shelter, Leah?" She shook her head, her eyes downcast again. "I don't like it there. People shout. They argue. It's worse than being out here sometimes." Ethan didn't know what to say. He wanted to tell her that the shelter was supposed to help people, that it was meant to keep her safe, but he could see it in her eyes. She didn't believe that. She had been failed too many times to trust in any kind of system. Ethan's mind raced. He had to do something, but what? He couldn't just walk away from her. Not now. Not after everything he'd heard. This wasn't a routine call. This was a child who had been discarded, left to fend for herself in a world that was too big, too cold, and too unforgiving. "Leah," Ethan said firmly, his voice soft but determined. "You're not alone. I'm going to help you. I promise. We'll get you to a safe place, somewhere you don't have to be afraid. Do you trust me?" She looked up at him then, her eyes wide, uncertain, but there was a flicker of something. Maybe hope, maybe doubt. For the first time, she didn't look like a girl trapped in a world of hopelessness. For a moment, Ethan allowed himself to believe it too, that maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. The road to trust. The cold wind continued to rustle the leaves in the park, sending a chill through the air that made Ethan pull his jacket tighter around his body. His eyes never left Leah, who remained huddled on the bench, her arms still wrapped tightly around her knees. The silence between them was heavy, pregnant with unspoken words, but Ethan could feel something stirring within her, a glimmer of vulnerability, the faintest flicker of trust. He had to do something, anything, to make her believe that there was a way out of this. "Leah," Ethan said, kneeling down in front of her again. His voice was steady, trying to reassure her. "You don't have to stay here anymore. We can get you somewhere safe, somewhere people care about you. I'll make sure you're okay." Leah shifted slightly, but her eyes stayed locked on the ground. She didn't respond at first, but Ethan could see the internal battle unfolding within her. She was scared. She was scared of trusting him, scared of what might happen next. But the walls around her were cracking, just a little bit. "Do you remember what I said earlier?" Ethan continued, keeping his tone gentle but insistent. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help. But if you don't let me in, I can't do anything. You don't have to face this alone, Leah." A long pause followed. The sound of her breath was the only noise that filled the space between them, shallow and steady. For a long time, she didn't respond. But then, her voice broke the silence. Quiet, fragile, like she was testing the waters. "I don't know where to go," she whispered, her words almost drowned by the sound of the wind. "I don't know who to trust anymore." Ethan's heart clenched as he listened to her. She wasn't just lost in the physical sense. She was lost in every way that mattered. Her parents had abandoned her. The system had failed her. And now, here she was, in a world that felt too big, too cold, with no one to lean on. He nodded, understanding more than she knew. "I get it," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You've been through things no one should have to, but you're not alone anymore. I'm not going to leave you out here to fend for yourself. You have my word." Leah's eyes flickered up toward him, her gaze hesitant but searching. She was still holding herself tight, but there was something in her expression now, a tentative hope, a spark of possibility. Ethan felt it too, that small, fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he could be the one to help her rebuild her trust in the world. He stood up slowly, keeping his movements deliberate, not wanting to startle her. "Let me take you to the station. I'll make sure you get the care you need, Leah. You won't have to sleep in a park again. I promise." Leah hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the distant shadows of the park, toward the dark corner where she had spent countless nights. The bench, the swings, the trees, they had been her shelter for so long. It was all she had known for the past few months, maybe longer. She didn't want to let go of it, not entirely. But at the same time, the thought of leaving it behind, of stepping into something different, something better, felt both terrifying and comforting. I don't know," Leah said, her voice barely a whisper. What if they don't care? What if they just make me leave again?" Ethan knelt down in front of her, meeting her eyes with a steady gaze. "This time is different," he assured her. "You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go. You have the right to be safe. You have the right to be cared for. I'm not going to let you be pushed around again. I'll stay with you the whole way through." For a moment, there was only silence. The wind had died down a little, the rustling of the trees fading into the background. Leah seemed to be wrestling with herself, her thoughts turning over in her mind like an endless loop. Ethan could see the internal struggle written across her face, the conflict between what she had known and what she desperately longed for. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she looked up at him. Her expression was still uncertain, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, a tentative trust, a fragile hope that maybe this time, things would be different. "Okay," Leah said, her voice soft, yet steady. "I'll go with you. But what happens after that?" Ethan smiled, a small but genuine smile. "One step at a time. he said. "First, we get you to safety. Then we figure everything else out. You don't have to worry about the rest right now." Leah nodded slowly, her gaze still uncertain but with a hint of relief. She stood up shakily, still hugging her arms around herself, as though she were afraid that if she let go, the world would come crashing down around her again. Ethan gave her a moment, making sure she felt ready before he gently guided her toward the patrol car. As they walked together, the sounds of the world around them seemed to fade away. The chirping of the crickets, the distant hum of traffic, it all grew quieter, more distant, as though the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next step in this unexpected journey. When they reached the patrol car, Ethan opened the passenger door for her, his hand lingering just a moment before he gestured for her to get inside. Leah hesitated for a moment, looking at the vehicle as though it were an alien thing, something she didn't quite understand. But then, after a deep breath, she climbed inside, the door clicking shut behind her. Ethan circled around to the driver's side, his mind racing with what had just transpired. He had made the promise, but it was far from over. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't give up on her. He started the engine, the sound of the car's hum filling the silence between them. "We'll get you the help you need, Leah," he said softly, as he turned the car onto the road. "You're not alone anymore." Leah didn't respond, but Ethan noticed her glance toward him in the rearview mirror. There was still a wariness in her eyes, but there was something else too. Something softer, something more hopeful. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a flicker of hope himself. Maybe he wasn't just doing his job tonight. Maybe, just maybe, he was saving someone's life. As Ethan drove through the darkened streets, the weight of what lay ahead hung in the air. Leah was a long way from the playground now, but they both had a long road ahead of them. And though neither of them could predict what the future would bring, one thing was certain: they had taken the first step toward healing, and for the first time in a long while, the future seemed a little less uncertain. A fragile beginning. The car hummed steadily along the dimly lit streets, the headlights casting long shadows across the sidewalks and rows of houses. The city seemed to hold its breath as the night deepened, the usual buzz of life replaced by an eerie quiet that seemed to press in on all sides. Inside the patrol car, Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, his thoughts racing, but his face remained calm. Beside him, Leah sat silently, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Ethan stole a glance at her from time to time, noting how stiffly she sat, as if bracing herself for something he couldn't quite understand. She didn't speak, but the tension in her body was palpable, and the silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and uncertainty. After a few minutes, Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. "Leah, if you're uncomfortable, you can say something. I know this isn't easy." Leah glanced over at him, but her eyes quickly darted back to the window, as if trying to shut out everything around her. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed a note of unease. Ethan didn't push. He knew better than to force someone to open up when they weren't ready. Instead, he focused on the road, letting the rhythmic hum of the car fill the space between them. He wondered how long it would take before Leah began to feel comfortable enough to talk, or if she would ever truly feel safe enough to trust him. The thought of her being alone for so long, with no one to care for her, made a pit form in his stomach. He had seen things, terrible things, in his line of work, but this was different. Leah's suffering wasn't caused by a criminal or a situation he could easily fix. No, her pain was rooted in abandonment and neglect, a quiet, insidious kind of suffering that no badge or gun could put an end to. His thoughts were interrupted when they reached the local police station. The building stood like a silent sentinel, its stark lights cutting through the darkness. Ethan pulled into the parking lot and parked near the entrance. He killed the engine, and the car went silent once again. "Leah," Ethan said softly, his voice careful. "We're here. We're going to get you the help you need." She didn't respond at first. Leah just sat there, her eyes focused on the door, her fingers still trembling slightly. Ethan could see the way she hesitated, as though weighing her options. "Do you want to stay in the car for a minute?" Ethan asked. "We can take it slow. No pressure." Leah shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm ready. I don't know what happens next." Ethan nodded, understanding. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, then walked around to her side and opened the door. Leah glanced up at him, her expression still wary, but there was a slight shift in her demeanor. Maybe it was the quiet reassurance in his voice, or maybe it was the fact that she finally had someone who wasn't just trying to get something from her. "Come on," Ethan said gently, offering his hand. "You don't have to do this alone." Leah stared at his hand for a long moment, and Ethan waited patiently, not pushing, just letting her make the decision. Then, after a long pause, Leah placed her hand in his. It was a small, hesitant gesture, but it was something. Something that told him she was starting to trust him, even if just a little bit. They walked toward the station's entrance together, Leah's small form shadowing his as they passed through the doors. The warmth of the station's interior was a stark contrast to the cold night air, and for a moment, Leah seemed to hesitate at the threshold. The buzz of activity, the sound of voices and phones ringing, and the steady clatter of keyboards, everything about the station felt foreign and overwhelming to her. Ethan could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the way her body tensed as they passed through the lobby, like she was about to be thrust into something she couldn't control. The thought of her being thrust into yet another cold, bureaucratic system made his chest tighten. He had to make sure she didn't feel abandoned here too. "Leah," he said softly, turning to her once they reached the desk. "We're going to talk to a counselor. They'll help you figure out what comes next. And I'll be right here the whole time. You don't have to go through this alone." Leah nodded slowly, but her eyes darted around the room, as though looking for an exit. She wasn't ready to trust this place. He could see it in the way her shoulders were hunched, the way she clung to his side like a lifeline. Ethan led her to a quiet room in the back of the station where they could talk to a social worker, a woman named Emma who had a reputation for working with kids like Leah, kids who had been through the worst that life had to offer and still somehow managed to hang on. Emma had dealt with the aftermath of families shattered by addiction, violence, and neglect. She knew how to speak to kids who had learned to keep their guard up, and she had a calming presence that seemed to settle even the most anxious of souls. "Emma, this is Leah," Ethan introduced, his voice warm as he gestured to the social worker. "Leah, Emma is here to help. She's a good person, and she knows how to make sure you get everything you need." Leah looked at Emma, her eyes hesitant, but she didn't pull away. Emma gave her a gentle smile, a kindness that was hard to ignore. "Hi, Leah," Emma said softly. "I know this is a lot to take in, but we're going to get through this. You're safe here." Leah's gaze flickered between Ethan and Emma, her lips pressed together tightly. She was still so guarded, still so afraid of being let down again. But Emma didn't push. Instead, she sat down across from Leah, keeping her voice gentle but firm. "Leah," Emma said, "I want you to know something. No one here is going to make you do anything you don't want to do. We're here to help you, but we need to know what you need. Do you want to talk about what's been going on?" Leah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes darting around the room. Finally, her voice broke the silence, though it was barely a whisper. "I don't know what to say." Emma nodded, not pressing her, but letting Leah know that whenever she was ready, they would be there to listen. Ethan stood back, leaning against the wall, his arms folded across his chest. He could feel the weight of the moment, the tension in the air. But for the first time since he'd met Leah, he felt like they were on the right path. There was still so much uncertainty ahead, but they were making progress. And that small, tentative trust Leah had shown him, that was something. As the minutes stretched into hours, Ethan stayed with Leah, watching from the doorway as she and Emma talked quietly. The process was slow, but it was happening. Leah was beginning to open up, piece by piece. There were moments of silence, but they weren't uncomfortable. There was a kind of understanding between them, a silent agreement that things could get better. As the night wore on, Leah's posture softened just a little, the walls around her heart starting to crumble, bit by bit. She was still frightened, still unsure of what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. And that was a beginning. Rebuilding a broken soul. The following days felt like a blur to Leah, each one blending into the next as she navigated the unfamiliar territory of the system that was supposed to help her. She stayed in a temporary foster care home, a small but warm house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, far removed from the streets and playgrounds where she had spent so many nights. At first, the change was overwhelming. The soft carpet underfoot, the warm meals, the safety of a roof over her head. It all felt strange, like it didn't belong to her. It was like living someone else's life, a life she hadn't even known could exist. For so long, she had gotten used to the cold steel of the park bench and the harsh wind biting at her skin. She had learned to survive, not to live. And now she was expected to feel at home in a place that, in some ways, felt like an alien world. But as the days passed, Leah began to adjust, albeit slowly. She started attending counseling sessions with Emma, the social worker, and as time went on, she started to talk. Not all at once, but bit by bit. Emma had a way of speaking to her that made her feel like she was being heard, like her words mattered. That was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Emma encouraged Leah to express her feelings through art, to draw or paint what she couldn't say aloud. Leah wasn't much of an artist, but she gave it a try. The first few drawings were abstract, chaotic lines and splashes of color. Anger, sadness, confusion, all jumbled together. But over time, her work became more coherent. The colors became softer, the lines more intentional. She drew a house, a real one, with a front door she could walk through without fear. She drew a playground again, but this time it was sunny, with children laughing, a peaceful place, a safe place. One afternoon, after she had finished a drawing, Leah sat quietly at the table in the small room she had made her own. It wasn't much, just a bed, a dresser, a lamp, but it was hers, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a small sense of ownership, something to call her own. There was a knock at the door, and Emma peeked her head in, her face warm and kind. "Hey, Leah," she said, her voice soft. "How are you feeling today?" Leah glanced at her drawing, then at Emma. Her expression was still guarded, but there was something different in her eyes. I think I'm starting to get it," she said quietly. "It's not perfect, but it feels real, like maybe I could really have a life again." Emma smiled gently, crossing the room and sitting down beside her. "That's a big step, Leah. It's okay to take your time. We're not rushing anything. What you're doing right now, working through your feelings, it's powerful. And you're doing it. You're stronger than you know." Leah looked down at her hands, fingers still trembling slightly. She was proud of herself, but there was still a part of her that couldn't fully believe in the possibility of a future. It felt like something she could reach out and touch, but it always slipped just beyond her grasp. "What happens after this?" Leah asked, her voice uncertain. "After the drawings, after the talking, what comes next?" Emma took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Next, we start building a new future for you. It might be small steps, but we'll do it together. You'll finish school, you'll learn new things, and you'll meet people who want to help you. Real people who care. You can start making choices about your life, and those choices will matter." Leah turned to look out the window, her brow furrowed in thought. "But what if I mess up? What if I can't keep up with everyone else?" Emma placed a hand on her shoulder, her touch gentle but reassuring. "It's okay to mess up, Leah. Life doesn't come with a manual, and everyone makes mistakes. The important part is learning from them, not giving up. We're all going to help you find your way. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Leah nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered in her heart. Could she really do this? Could she really rebuild the life that had been shattered so many times? That night, after dinner, Leah found herself sitting on the back porch of the foster home, looking out at the stars. The air was cool, but there was a stillness to it that felt calming. The sounds of the neighborhood, dogs barking in the distance, the faint hum of a car engine passing by, seemed so distant compared to the constant noise of the streets she had once called home. Her thoughts wandered back to Officer Ethan. He had been a constant presence in her life, since that night at the playground. The man who had broken through her wall of fear and helped her see that there was more to life than surviving. He had promised her safety, and so far, he had kept that promise. He had shown her that not all people were like the ones who had abandoned her. Leah still wasn't sure about everything, but she knew one thing for certain. Ethan cared, and that meant more than words could express. The sound of the door creaking open behind her startled her, and she turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway. His expression was warm, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice steady but kind. Leah hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. She scooted over on the bench, making room for him. Ethan stepped outside and sat down beside her, his presence grounding and steady. "It's a beautiful night," he said, glancing up at the sky. "The stars are bright tonight." Leah nodded, but her gaze was fixed on the ground. "I've never really looked at the stars before. Not like this." Ethan looked over at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" Leah hesitated, unsure of how to put her feelings into words. "I don't know. When you're just trying to survive, you don't have time for things like that. You're too busy trying to find somewhere to sleep, or worrying about what's going to happen next." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "I get it. When you're just trying to get by, it's hard to see the bigger picture." There was a long pause, the two of them sitting in companionable silence as the sounds of the night filled the air around them. For once, Leah felt like she wasn't alone. She didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. For the first time in so long, she could breathe without the constant weight of fear and worry. "Leah," Ethan said after a while, his voice gentle but firm, "you've come a long way in a short time. And I know it hasn't been easy, but I want you to know that I'm here for you. I'll be here for as long as you need me. You don't have to face this alone." Leah looked at him, her throat tight with emotion. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something better. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know where I'd be without you." Ethan smiled, his eyes softening. "You're stronger than you know, Leah. You've already made it through so much. You're going to be okay. I believe in you." And in that moment, Leah believed too. It wasn't all figured out. She wasn't healed, not yet. But for the first time, she saw the light at the end of the tunnel, and it felt like it was within her reach. The journey wasn't over, but it had begun. A new beginning. The days had begun to feel more like months, each one stretching into the next as Leah slowly settled into the life she had never known was possible. She was still adjusting, still testing the waters of this new world, but every day felt like another step in the right direction. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without challenges, but it was real, and it was hers. Leah had become a regular at the local community center, where she had enrolled in after-school tutoring and art classes. She wasn't an academic prodigy, but the tutors had been patient with her, helping her catch up on the lessons she had missed over the years. She had a knack for art, something she discovered when she was allowed to experiment with different mediums. Paint, pastels, charcoal. Every drawing, every sketch was a small window into her soul, a way for her to express the things words could not. Her relationship with Emma, her social worker, had grown deeper as well. The sessions had evolved from simply discussing the basics of her life to a space where Leah could truly open up about her fears, her dreams, and the things she had buried deep inside for so long. Emma didn't push her, didn't try to fix everything overnight, but rather, she gave Leah the room to grow at her own pace. One day, after a particularly long session, Emma sat down across from Leah, her face thoughtful. "Leah, you've made incredible progress over the past few months. But I know there's still some part of you that's holding back. You're still afraid that if you let go, it will all come crashing down." Leah hesitated, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her sleeve. She had become more open, yes, but the fear of being abandoned again, of being hurt again, still gnawed at her. The past had left scars that no amount of kindness or therapy could erase overnight. "I'm scared," Leah admitted, her voice trembling. "What if I start to believe this? What if I start to feel like I actually belong here? And then it all gets taken away?" Emma leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Leah, you do belong here. You've earned your place in this world. I understand that it's hard to trust that, especially when everything you've known has been so unstable, but you are not defined by your past. The people here, me, the teachers, the foster family, none of us are going anywhere. We're here because we believe in you." Leah felt a lump form in her throat, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself feel it. She let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved this peace, this safety, this new life. The next day, Leah found herself standing at the front of her art class, her hand trembling slightly as she set up her easel. The teacher, Miss Carter, had asked her to present her latest piece to the class, and for once, Leah felt a mix of pride and nerves, not about the quality of the work, but about the courage it took to share a piece of herself with others. The canvas in front of her was a vibrant explosion of colors, layers of blues, purples, and gold swirling together. At the center, there was a small figure, a girl, standing in a field of flowers, her arms outstretched to the sky, her face lifted toward the sun. It was a piece that Leah had poured everything into, a reflection of her journey from darkness to light. The class fell silent as she stood there, staring at the painting, unsure of what they would think. It felt like exposing the most vulnerable part of herself. The room was still for a moment before Miss Carter spoke, her voice soft but encouraging. "Leah, this is beautiful," she said, her eyes kind. "You've captured so much emotion here. This isn't just a painting. It's a story. It's your story." Leah felt a surge of warmth, a sense of pride that she hadn't known she could feel. She was standing in front of others, showing them a piece of her heart, and they weren't turning away. They were seeing her, not the broken, neglected girl who had been left behind, but the young woman who was beginning to heal. For the first time in her life, Leah felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was living. The months continued to pass, and Leah found herself growing in ways she hadn't imagined possible. She had become close to her foster family, the Thompsons, a couple with 2 young children of their own. They were kind, supportive, and had made it clear that Leah was part of their family, not just a temporary guest. They helped her with homework, made her laugh at the dinner table, and treated her like she belonged. They didn't expect her to be perfect, and they didn't ask her to forget her past. They just loved her for who she was. Ethan, too, had been a constant presence. He checked in on her regularly, sometimes bringing her favorite snacks, sometimes just sitting with her while she painted. He had even taken her to a baseball game one Saturday, something she'd never done before. The thrill of the crowd, the energy of the game, and the joy of spending time with someone who genuinely cared were experiences Leah would cherish forever. Ethan wasn't just her savior from the playground anymore. He had become a mentor, a friend, someone who had shown her that there was more to life than just getting by. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult therapy session, Leah found herself sitting outside in the quiet of the backyard. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the yard. She was thinking about everything she had been through, the pain, the loneliness, but also the hope that had been growing in her heart. She was beginning to see that her story wasn't over, that there was still so much more ahead of her. She heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching and turned to see Ethan walking toward her. He had that quiet confidence in his stride, the same way he had walked toward her the night he found her in the playground. "You doing okay?" he asked gently, sitting down beside her on the bench. Leah gave a small, tired smile. "I'm getting there. Slowly, but yeah, I'm okay." Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "You've come a long way. I'm proud of you, Leah. I know it hasn't been easy, but you're doing it. You're rebuilding your life." Leah's heart swelled at his words. They weren't just words of encouragement. They were a recognition of everything she had endured, everything she had fought through. And for the first time, she felt like it was all worth it. Every painful moment, every tear, every step backward. It had led her here, to this moment, to this new life she was beginning to embrace. "I'm not there yet," Leah said quietly, "but I'm starting to believe that I can be. That I'm allowed to have more than just survival. I'm allowed to be happy." Ethan's eyes softened with pride. "You're more than allowed, Leah. You deserve it." Leah looked out at the horizon, the setting sun casting a warm glow over everything. She could see the future now, not as a distant, unreachable dream, but as something real, something she could build with her own hands. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like the future was full of possibilities, full of hope.